Good morning. Welcome, everybody. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and you're tuning in for the 15th episode of the Clements Library Bookworm. Today's meeting will be recorded to share online, and you will all receive an email later with a link to the recording and, of course, any of the resources that we share today. I just want to give you a quick tutorial. It looks like people are figuring out the chat function. Please go ahead and continue to chime in. Let's keep the conversation going. Select all panelists and attendees when you participate in the chat function, please. And you'll notice that the conversation goes by very quickly. So because of that, we ask you, if you have questions today, please click on the Q&A section and enter your questions in there. There you can also look at the questions that other people are asking. If it's a question you have as well and that you'd like to hear and the answer to, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. That sends it to the top of the list. If you have comments about that question or answers, you can also comment on those questions. So go ahead and feel free to do that as well. My colleagues Ann Bennington-Helber and Tracy Pejovic will be participating in the chat section, providing links and answering any technical questions along the way. As well, I just want to point out that I can control some of the things that you see on the screen, but you do have the option to select side-by-side mode, which will put the slides beside the speaker, and you can open your chat bar then also, and you can change the size. It's a little different on every device, so you might have to play around with it a little bit. There's also the option of speaker view versus gallery view, so you may want to see which of those you like better. So go ahead and try out some of those options as well. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. And you know, Mary, I forgot to ask you before this program got started if you have any fun stories about tea time.
About tea time. Tea time. Tea time is one of our tea time at the Clements Library. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
I think tea time is one of the great traditions of the Clements Library, in which it's during which researchers and curators and volunteers all gather together for a cup of tea and usually something nice to eat and a chance to share not only their research, but their time at the library. And it's in those conversations that furthers both the work of the staff of the library and also helps researchers get to know each other. So I don't know that I've got any funny stories about it, but I have many delicious recipes as a result of what we've shared at tea time.
That's very true. And so part of the reason I asked that is this program, for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, when the stay-at-home order first began, we were trying to think of things we were going to miss most about being physically in the building. And tea time came up at the top of the list. And we sort of conceived this particular program as a way to gather some of that conversation and some of that knowledge sharing into an online format. So it was inspired by that love of tea time. Thanks. Today's episode is generously sponsored by the Michigan Map Society in collaboration with the Stephen Clark Library. The Michigan Map Society has long had a relationship with the Clements Library and the Clark Library. And a few years ago, the members chose to set up the Michigan Map Society Fund to help support an annual lecture on maps. And we had to cancel the in-person version this spring. But this endowed fund grows, so it has the potential of supporting other endeavors of the MAP division as well. So if you especially enjoy MAPs and you enjoy these kinds of programs, I encourage you to consider a gift to the Michigan MAP Society Fund. All right, last call for the poll today. So if you haven't had a chance to participate, go ahead and click quickly, and I'll end the results. All right, let's see what we got. Share results. All right, so as I think we expected, the apps, Google Maps, MapQuest, Waze, they're leading right now in the primary way to navigate. But also, not too surprisingly, given the interest in maps of this audience, people still refer to their road atlases and paper maps as well. And that doesn't surprise me. Look at all those landmark navigators, though. I don't know, those directions, they're always the hard ones to follow. So thank you, everybody, for participating in that. You know, it's funny, I kind of laughed at compass when I saw it on here, and then I realized that with our phones and with it being on the dashboard of the car, that my husband actually uses that. I've heard him often say, okay, we're still going north, you know, it's going to be, you know, if he's just trying to weave his way towards something. So it's fun to see how many people are using that as an option as well. Right. Get that out of the way. Well, I'm very excited today to welcome Mary Pedley and in conversation with author Martin Brückner. Mary is the Clements Assistant Curator of Maps, and she's going to host the conversation today about Martin's book, The Social Life of Maps in America, 1750 to 1860. Mary has worked with the Clements Library since 1984 and is the co-editor of the recently published The History of Cartography, Volume 4, Cartography in the European Enlightenment, which is really exciting, Mary. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
Her own research interests focus on map production and commerce in 18th century France and England. Well, I'm very excited for this conversation. Thanks so much to both of you. Mary, would you like to take it away and introduce Martin?
Well, thank you, Angela. Introduce Martin with great pleasure. Martin knows the Volume 4 Cartography in the European Enlightenment well, since he's one of our 207 contributors to that volume, having written an excellent and revelatory entry on wall maps, which if you get a chance to read it in the volume, it also links to some of the work he's doing now. He serves as director of the program in American Material Culture at Winterthur, while still being a professor of English at the University of Delaware. And Martin's interests are rooted in early American literature and culture, and he especially focuses on print culture and the visual arts. And it's that interest that has led him to maps and America's spatial imagination. And I've shared Martin's view of maps, that they are often overlooked but important sources for understanding society and culture. So his book gave me an opportunity to talk with him today and share that conversation with all of you. And I'll start by asking him about the title of the book, because I hope you had the same question that I did when I first read it, which is The Social Life of Maps in America. And it immediately made me ask, how can maps as inanimate objects have a social life? So Martin, welcome.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Mary, and thank you to all for being here. I'm calling in from a very rainy day in Philadelphia. So the question is the social life of maps, and I want to give you a short answer. When my daughters heard about the title, the answer was, or the question was, so two maps are going to the bar, what's going to happen next? And in this case, I actually could turn around and tell them, well, there were actually tons of maps in bars and in taverns and in coffee houses. And not only there, they were permeating American social spaces, whether it was government buildings or private homes of the rich and the poor. If you go into probate records and wills, they also permeated American people's personal spaces. You could have wall maps in your bedroom. You could have table maps on display in your studies or in your parlor. And then you would have had school maps in the kids' hands, and you would have had pocket maps in your coat pockets, or for ladies, then it would have been a tie-on pocket. So basically, when we talk about maps, we tend, and this is the social life angle on when we talk about maps, we usually are focusing on what's on the inside of maps, on the design, on the contents, can I find a place? But we forget to look beyond the edges of the map, and what happens on the edges, beyond the edges of the map, literally physically on the edges of a map, and then outside of it in the environment surrounding the maps. And that's where these decades between 1715 and 1860 are really fascinating to drill down into American cartography, the history of American cartography, because during this period, maps became bestsellers, and they came to define all kinds of social relationships, from workplace relationships to school life, to public offices, and then also to the idea of personal identity. So maps really could be best understood, the social life of maps could be best understood in two ways. One is to think of it that it means to recognize a map as a material base and as a media platform that was deeply rooted in the social fabric of America. And second, it means to look at the way how maps behave during their lives, call it the biography of a map. And as maps moved from basically production to, or from cradle to grave, if you want to be more dramatic, from making these maps as coming out of original land surveys to then actually printing them commercially and mass producing them, getting them into the consumer hands. And then it gets really exciting to think about or learn, what did people actually do with the maps? We have certain preconceptions that we, I think, brought to the idea of what maps, what the cultural work of maps is. But I think in my book, I really try to figure out, well, what did people actually really do with them?
Well, your daughter's beginning of the joke about two maps walk into the bar lead me to what they might have said to each other. And one of them might have said, who's this third guy over here who's a professor of literature? What's he doing in a map bar? So I'm wondering then, what led you as a professor of English, to be writing this book? Was it a brand new ground for you, or was it kind of a next step in your own research interests?
It's a bit of everything. I think I have to always come clean saying I was trained as a land surveyor in the German army. So there's that. I was a student of historical geography in Germany for my master's degree, as I was also becoming a student or training as a student in American studies and American literature. So that is probably the kind of intellectual background for why do I focus on maps. But actually the real interest for this book came out of my first volume, my first monograph, The Geographic Revolution in Early America, where I was being the English professor, where I was teasing out what is the role of geography, the language of geography, what kind of role does the language of geography play in early American literature, or in general in the kind of textual landscapes that people were inhabiting between 1700 and 1850. In that context, I discovered that people on the one hand were increasingly becoming not only geographically literate, but they become especially map literate, so that there's suddenly this aspect of cartographic literacy. And the other element of insight was that people really tripped over very concrete maps, whether it's a novel, whether it is a biography, whether it's Jefferson's Natural History of Virginia. The authors cited specific maps, and that got me interested. So what were these maps? What did they really play? What kind of roles did they play, not only in these authors' lives, but generally in American culture? And that was pretty much the starting point for drilling down into this book manuscript. In the very early stages, what really, and I need to ask you to move forward the slide, please, what really captured my attention was the story that surrounds Henry Popple's map of the British Empire in America. This is a huge map. It's measuring about 8 by 8 feet or 2 by 2 meters, It was hanging in every state house. The Board of Trade in England basically mandated that this map had to be purchased, whether you liked it or not in the colonies. The map came out in 1733, and within a year already, it was lambasted for being a bad map. It was inaccurate. It took liberties of adding information that didn't exist. I mean, basically fictional map elements. And yet this map was hanging in state houses, and it also hung in people's private homes, especially Benjamin Franklin, who ordered it twice for his own personal consumption. So you have to ask, what is going on when we think of somebody like Benjamin Franklin, that is somebody who we associate with being really on the kind of side of rational thinking, on the side of trying to come up with scientific protocols. What is going on with somebody like him endorsing a map, even consuming a map that was, by all intents and purposes, not doing what a map is supposed to do, namely represent the world, at least relatively accurately. And this other anecdote that goes around with this map is that not only Franklin owned it, it was hanging in Independence Hall, or then the Assembly Hall of, of Pennsylvania. But then when the founders were living in Philadelphia, John Adams saw this map on display in Independence Hall, and he writes this letter to Abigail, his wife, saying, it's a huge map. I mean, this equivalent of him saying, wow, it's a huge map, and it's really bad, but fundamentally it's large. And he was still struck and smitten by this. So that was one of the major hooks for me to ask. So these maps played a role that is definitely going beyond what we associate with map knowledge or with using maps as a wayfinding tool. These were display objects. These were meant to be symbolic objects, and they played a very specific role in particular time periods, but they also adapted their roles to different scenarios. And if you can go to the next slide, please. One of these scenarios is the domestic sphere. And here I'm giving you as an example, Edward Savage's portrait of the Washington family. At the center of this portrait is yet another portrait, and that is the map or the plan of the city of Washington. Here is the printed product by John Reed. And what is fascinating about this painting is that it was meant to be 9 feet wide. So imagine a huge giant canvas. If you came to view it, you'd almost be, it's like a life-size representation of the sitters. And you were basically invited to be part of that map reading moment. And here we have multiple generations interact with the map. You see George Washington and Martha Custis. You see his adopted grandchildren, Eleanor to the right and George to on his right. And then you also see one of his enslaved people. We think it is either Christopher Shields or William Lee. I think the word is still out on who the Black figure is. But even in his household, in this case, a slave-owning plantation owner's household, we have enslaved people also interacting with maps, in this case on the margins, kind of with a sly glance possibly, or at least trying to look over the shoulder of the sitters. But what is fascinating about this map moment is, and this is the other hook that really made me get more and more interested in figuring out what is the social life of maps, is the way in which people physically had to handle the object of the map, that the map was a material artifact. Here you can see how the map is unrolled, unscrolled, and it's because of the paper tension, it's trying to actually roll back again. So people having physically to keep it open. Washington's hand, of course, is resting kind of carefully and leisurely on the map, signaling control and perhaps even dominance. But at the same time, Martha is pointing, right? So we have women and men, children and adults, free people and enslaved people interact with these maps. And again, that of course is leading to an explosion of questions like what is happening with maps in the American environment during, let's say, the 1750s and then up to the 1860s.
Well, I think that takes us to, you know, from both the capacity of maps to engender shock and awe, to the actual domestic embrace of and comfort level with maps. But the period you've chosen is an interesting one, and I know you're going to tell us about it, but 1750 to 1860 is not the usual textbook of American history chapter division. There's pre-revolution, post-revolution, federalism, run up to the Civil War. These are the dates, though, that are the parentheses of your book. So just run us through how you arrived at that particular beginning and end.
Right. So, and I guess the listeners too, I mean, you all may have tripped over this, in many ways, what looks like a logical, but also is an artificial periodization of American history, right? We use certain events as like the markers. In my case, it was really not so much historical events. And usually that's how we think about maps, right? Which map was actually the trigger for revolution, which map was the trigger for the Civil War, perhaps, or which map documents a certain historical moment best. That was not the motivation for me. It was realizing that in this time span between 1750, actually more like 1755 and 1860, Americans experienced the explosion of maps as a printed good in their society. This is the period when the map industry basically matures from, forgive me if I use that as a metaphor, but really matures from being a shopkeeper's solitary person's enterprise to becoming a vertically integrated staple in a publishing house's arsenal of printed goods. And in sheer numbers, this is the period when we see the output of maps go from a few thousand printed total in colonial America to suddenly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or as one publisher, William Thayer, boasted, millions of maps were printed in his shop, in his workshop. So I guess to give you guys a sense of what is happening in this, and to explain also a little bit why I chose this time frame, is to walk you through a few of the stages of how maps were made. And with that, I want to start actually by going back into the colonial decades, just before the American Revolution, when we have to remind ourselves that the American map industry was pretty much non-existent until, next slide please, until this particular cartographer and land surveyor, Lewis Evans, entered the marketplace. There were some others, obviously. I mean, it was not just him alone, but most maps before were usually import articles. Americans were consuming maps. My research into shop advertisements and also people's private wills and probate records demonstrate, yes, I mean, if you were rich, if you were poor, you did have a map somewhere in your house. But by 1750, the 1750s, and of course, we can put two and two together. The French and Indian War is kicking in and tensions are high. Americans were really craving maps that were made by their own citizens, or in this case, British subjects living in America. And somebody like Lewis Evans, and I'm using him as a sample, as an example, who basically tried to create a addressing people's concern on the East Coast and people's sense of space and sense of belonging on the East Coast. He was a land surveyor, so in order to make this map, he actually had spent years and years surveying New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and then he of course created an archive of his own. He was sponsored by Benjamin Franklin, and with the help of other maps that he had that he had available, he built or constructed his own map, which was laborious. You had to draw this map. It goes to multiple drawings. Then you had to find a printer. It had to be printed by, you basically had to outsource it. You had to pay for the printing yourself out of pocket. It was hugely expensive. In his lifetime, he had to deal with censorship because the British government, of course, was not too keen on letting all kinds of information come out. And then in the end, at best, he was able to noodle off 250 really clean, crisp copies on his on the local printing press. And there were only two printers who had a roller printing press in Philadelphia at this point. And Benjamin Franklin's shop is most likely the one that created the maps that you see on display here. But it took off. It became a bestseller, unbeknownst to him. I mean, Lewis Evans never really quite got to see the success of his map. He died in 1756. But it gives you a sense of this is a multi-year project. It's something that you basically can't live off. You can't make a living off. He had to be a tutor. He had to be a land surveyor on the side. He had to basically have a full-time job in order to be the map maker. That is the artisanal map, as I call it, the shopkeepers or craftsman's style map. Within a few decades, especially during the second decade after the Revolutionary War started, so if you can go to the next slide, please, things changed. They changed slowly, but there were changes in the sense that publishers realized maps were selling, that there was an appetite for maps. So we are getting into this world of early stage capitalism, supply and demand. Is really kind of shaping the world of map making in this case. And the Philadelphia publisher and printer Matthew Carey basically took on this project of creating one of the very first American atlases. Again, the logic being, we've been importing these maps, we've been never really able to create our own maps. Let's build our own atlas that we can then actually use to represent the newly formed United States to our citizens who are clamoring for maps. He hired Samuel Lewis, who was a draftsman by training, an engraver actually by training, who then, I think initially his background is a little bit fuzzy until he comes to America, but who then very quickly discovered that besides being a drawing instructor or writing instructor, you could actually make a living as a map draftsman, as somebody who is drawing maps. And he took on to produce one of the first very quickly selling map of the United States. You can see an unfortunately slightly fuzzy image on the left here. A later version of his map is the one that the Clements Library has in its holdings. This is the 1817 atlas map of his, of the United States. So here's someone, in this case, Matthew Carey, the publisher, who is beginning to adopt a model of production that was already going on in Europe, in London and Paris, where you outsource all the labor for making a map, and you as the publisher are actually taking control of the product. Hence, the atlas is also called Carey's Atlas, even though he didn't draw a single map. He didn't even collect the information necessary for a single map, but it became his map atlas, and it was labeled after him. There's Carey's Pocket Atlas, then his American Atlas. So that gives you a sense, suddenly we have a new business model. It didn't really take off. People still couldn't really make a living off of this. And if you go into the histories of individual publishers and map makers, maps were like a little sidebar until the 1810s. Anybody who was actually trying to make maps had to have a daytime job, whether as silversmith, as sometimes they were farmers, sometimes they were politicians. So it's a really interesting mix at this point. It's not quite an industry the way we think of as like a business model that is really geared towards creating a great output of maps. And that brings me to the next stage in the kind of social life of maps as people are making maps and the number of people that are involved in making maps. And I realized I've skipped a slide. Can we go over to the next slide, please? In this process of making slides, and this applies to the next stage as well, what Carey discovered is he had his shop on Market Street, or then also known King Street, and he had his own shop display windows. His business actually would have been probably the house to the furthest on the left, I mean, third house in from the furthest on the left. And what he did was, when he outsourced all the various components of building a map, if you look at the overview map, which I was able to get from Billy Smith, a historian at Montana State, who allowed me to plunk down all my data and create this kind of a thematic map of map production in Philadelphia, there you can see that pretty much all work was conducted within like a 4-block radius of Carey's shop. So that was the moment when it's not the solitary shopkeeper who just kind of works away in his little attic and then maybe has a little shop downstairs where he can sell his wares, but here's somebody who's actually consolidating, outsourcing, but at the same time consolidating labor from different fields, whether it's the map maker, the map painter, the draftsperson, the bookbinder, the coppersmith, anybody who has a hand in creating the actual physical map or the atlas. And now that gets me to the next slide. And this brings us to the industrial age of map making. And that's when people took a page from Carey's initial attempt of how do I consolidate all these different work steps, but instead of outsourcing them all over town, they actually began to consolidate them under one roof. Actually, quite literally, the Mitchell Company, these were publishing houses that then were in dialogue with a printing house, sometimes with their own printing house themselves. And they began to experiment with a highly diversified portfolio of map products. Here I gave you as an example, Mitchell's National Map. What we see as a magnified version is actually the Pocket Atlas version that is folded up, and you can see in the margin to the right, the actual cover for this particular map. But the same map would have been published or sold as a wall map, and you can see this on the lower left, which would have been then hung up on rollers with hardware and etc., magnified to the point that you have all kinds of small maps encircling the actual map image of the nation state. And then on the top, this little booklet, which was one of these eureka moments as a researcher, is a subscription book. This is how the salesman, and this is when you realize the map industry really had taken off into its own kind of emporium almost of map making and selling, that you had now drummers, traveling salesmen going door to door, asking people for subscribing to buying a map. And that would have been the book where they put down their names and the money that they would be owed and so forth. The next slide, please. What happened, though, to make these maps possible was a technological revolution that really can be dated to the 1820s, early to 1820s, and it was fourfold. It had to do, on the one hand, with the fact that map paper, which actually was its own genre of paper as a paper good, as a paper product, map paper now suddenly became available as a machine-made commodity. So instead of having single sheets that were laboriously made by hand, you now actually have scrolls of 1,000 feet long paper scrolls that you could then use in order to cut and slice to whatever size of map you wanted. The other component in the technological advances was the change in printing press dynamics. In this case, the introduction of not only printing presses that could handle large sheets, in this case, large steel plates, or later on, large lithographic stones. They were steam powered. And I chose this little, in this case, actually it's magnified. I chose the slide that advertises the Wagner and McGuigan's lithographic printing shop, or in this case, printing factory, you should say. And it includes all the different work steps that were going into making a lithographic image, lithographic print in this case, including maps. And the logic there is it's all in one house. And places like Wagner and McGuigan, they were in Philadelphia, near Chestnut Street or Spruce Street. One example, there is the Peter Duval, another famous engraver of the period who had his own printing house. He had a similar setup where I think the moment he shifted from manually powered printing presses to steam powered printing presses. He actually had a party for all his employees and for all his family and friends. So about 500 people stomped around in his building, and he had all 20 printing presses running on full steam, noodling off whatever he had at the moment on as plates on these different printing presses. Among them were maps, but it's one of these hilarious accounts when you realize how this is the segue where we go from maps being a single object or singular object that is kind of rare or rarefied in a way because there are only so many editions you can print of one particular copper plate, to suddenly being able to print enormous amounts of maps, 10,000 a day by the end of the 1850s by one printing company. So that gives you a sense of proportions. A final point of technological revolutions I try to hint or gesture at, and my book does this a bit more elaborately, is just the change from copper plate printing to lithographic printing. And if you look at the two Brazil maps by the Mitchell Company on the lower left, you can just see, at least by dint of like squinting your eyes a little bit to kind of take in the way in which the map is communicating information. The one that was copper plate printed on the one that's slightly higher is incredibly detailed, but it's also in a way not necessarily eye-catching. And the moment you have lithographic printing involved, you can actually spruce up your map very easily, very cost-effectively by having elaborately ornate borders added to the map image. You can have a different way of prioritizing lettering. You have all kinds of colors that can come into play. Color printing was not quite the thing yet in the 1860s for maps, but it became definitely the path forward for, by the time the 1860s were over, lithographed maps were by that point also color printed maps. So that gives you a sense, just in terms of production. A last word on that is just the sheer number of people involved. And really from the land surveyor, we have to remind ourselves somebody had to collect the data and just kind of create the data so that we could make a map. but that became actually, in history of cartography, we don't really talk about it too much. Their work gets eclipsed very quickly by people who are the map engravers or map draftsmen or women. And that is something we lose sight of, because those guys were not necessarily map trained people. They just did the chore of drawing. They did just the task of printing. So there is like a fascinating moment when you realize a lot of different professions overlap with the production of maps. And that is one of the moments when the social life of maps, at least in the cradle stage, right, they're not quite yet sold. That's when you see these objects taking off.
I love the almost the animation you've given maps. I do see how they take on their own social life, because they're becoming bigger, louder, more intrusive in space, not only with their size, but with their decoration, with their color, with their marketability, and the role of the publisher in all this is very, very significant, because the publisher is putting the money in, the publisher is paying the engravers, paying the press people, owning the presses in the case. And one of the things I've enjoyed very much about your book is that you not only take this broad overview and technical overview of production, but you also back it up with stories of the people behind it, from Lewis Evans on to Matthew Carey to Augustus Mitchell. Maps are in the end made by people, and their story doesn't always get told. And I always feel that it's important to ask about any particular biography that stands out to you, because I know you must have your own favorites among the characters that are in your book. So
yes, I do. Thanks for asking, because I mean the book is chock full with little vignettes of individual map makers, and but the thing is, I didn't want to get bogged down in telling the story of the actual maps, because they are my heroes. I think of these maps as actually the characters that populate my novel, so to speak. No, the biography of individual map makers, one particular, and next slide please, one particular stands out, and that is John Mellish. He's almost like the parade example of how people fell into map making, how they just had a love for maps. And I bet this is something the audience right now is really identifying with, where there was an affinity between the individual and the experience of navigating the world by map. And John Mellish was an immigrant, a Scotsman. He traveled the United States in the late 18th century already, and then throughout the first decade of the 19th century. Working for an import-export company that was probably working mostly on buying and selling cotton. And so he traveled in the South quite a bit. But then he published his travel diary in the 1808 and 1809. And he attached a bunch of really rudimentary maps that he drew himself. And the logic being was that I cannot imagine, that these are his words, that he couldn't imagine publishing a work about travel without also appending a map to it. And then something happened, and there are no records really explaining what particularly, but he settled down in Philadelphia, and going against any economic wisdom, decided, I want to become a map publisher. And I mean, whatever, he must have had personal capital that he basically used to start up his business. And he began drawing his own maps, basically map draftsman. And that is so true for so many of these original map makers. And it decision to become a map maker coincided with the beginning of the War of 1812. And of course, you kind of maybe can put two and two together, that the demand for maps at this point, of course, is astounding. People are really eager to read maps. I mean, I give you here in the margins a quote from the New York Gazette and General Advertiser, where the author writes, "Public curiosity is at this time awake, and every class of citizens must be peculiarly interested in passing events. Who would not wish to trace the progress of the war, the path of conquest, and the loopholes of retreat? The possessor of this map can do it all, both on the seacoast and in the interior, seated at ease by his peaceful fireside." And the map that is facing this quote is actually one of the best-selling War of 1812 maps, the seat of war maps, as it was called as a genre, by Mellish. And something in this design really resonated with his audience. I mean, it was a minimalist design, right? As you can look even from a distance in a kind of the tiny format on screen. He's really just emphasizing the broad outlines of states and a few place names, and that's about it. But what is fascinating about his map, it really captured the public imagination, and it was just selling like hotcakes. And next slide, please. With that, he basically expanded his portfolio of maps from the seat of war maps to then building school atlas maps. And then in 1816, he published the map of the United States, which is the first map to actually shows the nation state from coast to coast. In the western areas, he's actually incorporating the map that was then the Lewis and Clark map. He basically just plagiarized and copied it over. But this is the map that was basically giving him suddenly financial stability, but also financial freedom and tremendous success. The quote, this one that I'm citing here in the margins, it was published in the Academician, which is one of the very first teachers' journals, where the reviewer of the Mellish map portfolio declares that many of the bookstores in the United States have maps for sale, but the only establishment on the continent of America exclusively appropriated to the disposal of maps and charts is that of Mr. John Mellish of Philadelphia. That tells us something, because at this point, there is no one business associated with a name and the idea that this is a map publisher. We think of Rand McNally today. I mean, we think of any other major publishing house that specializes in maps, but Mellish is the first one to actually get recognized as such. And he took his cue from Carey and consolidated all the work efforts in his private home on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. It would have been on the block that now has been raised, diagonally across from Independence Hall on Chestnut Street. But he actually was one of these guys who really took a great risk. And then also, and this is where the biography stands out, his biography stands out, it became a tragic story because the moment the interest in maps failed, or people had found other map makers whose image of maps, the kind of maps that they produced were more appealing, the moment that happened, his business flagged, and he basically within a couple of years after by 1820, he was bankrupt, and he died, I think, of not only bankrupt, but also perhaps of a broken heart in 1821. There's no word on what was the cause of his death, but he basically died very shortly after. And in an odd way, that is suddenly the bookend of this 5-year, 6-year, maybe 8-year run of this one map publisher who had his own business, made it big. He's being quoted left and right by Jefferson, by Madison, you name it, every president. Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine was actually discussed and also deliberated by using his maps. So that is one of these moments when you realize, here's a biography that has completely fallen by the wayside. We don't know much about this guy, but he was really instrumental in getting maps into the public's eye and into public consciousness. Another biography, next slide please, is what I call the unsung map makers. And that is the thousands, and I would say tens of thousands of American citizens who, ever since the 1780s, were trained to become map makers in school. Map making was actually part and staple of public education very early on. Initially, it was map literacy that was fostered by Noah Webster and his spelling books. But by the 1800s, it became a staple of basic education. So as a 10-year-old, and this is about the age range that I found when most pupils, boys and girls, but a lot of more girls apparently, were constructing their own maps. And when you look at these maps, it's just astonishing to see with how much detail and accuracy they were constructed, that often when they hang next to a printed map, you can actually tell which one is the printed one and which one is the manuscript map. A lot of sweat and labor went into these maps. And as a smaller image, I wanted to show you also the manuscript map that was produced in the African Free School in New York City in circa 1830 or 1820. Actually, my slide just cut off, so I couldn't see the date. I think 1820. And just to give you also a sense, so this was an exercise that was really carried out across the classes and across the type of people that we usually imagine don't have access to maps and cartography. So this is something one has to now really begin to wonder out loudly. And this is one thing that I really wished my book had been able to find more archives that allow us to recover. How did people, especially new immigrants and enslaved people, how did they interact with maps? Clearly, they didn't leave records where they said, oh, today I saw the map that showed me the way north or something like that. But we now, through circumstantial evidence, I think we can really expand our horizon and begin to think of how homemade maps are actually a staple that is participating in this explosion of maps in the American marketplace. So this would be my other biography. Sidebar, there's another story that I always love telling, and that's happening in Philadelphia. There is Lydia Bailey is the name. She is a widow and inherited from her husband a print shop, but she was not trained in the business at first, so she had to learn the trade basically secondhand, and then she became a very successful businesswoman in Philadelphia. But her starting point for her career was map coloring. And in her account books that have survived at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, in her account book, you can actually trace the number of girls, especially schoolgirls, showing up at her doorstep, bringing maps the size of 2 by 3 feet. So these are actually not small maps, dropping them off to get them colored, and then picking them up, and then like prized possessions, carry them through the city of Philadelphia back to their homes. So there's like this moment when you feel like, oh my gosh, these maps are really kind of inundating our urban spaces and probably also in the countryside, in the villages at the same time. So much for my unsung map makers.
I'm glad you brought up Lydia Bailey as the widow of a printer, because and the whole arc of the biographies of very often the map maker going bankrupt, the map maker dying in poverty, are reflected in Europe in the 18th century. And it's one thing we've learned very much in putting together the 4th volume of the history of cartography. So the European experience also goes from the artisanal map, the one-man show, to the industrial map. So the parallels with Europe are not surprising. There should be these parallels. But one thing really stands out when we get into the development of North America and mapping in the United States is the United States misses one thing that European nations did, and that's the centralization of map making and the creation of a federal map making industry. And I'm wondering if you found in your work, especially in 19th century, that whether this makes the American experience unique to leave map making entirely in the hands of commercial map makers.
Thank you, Mary. This is a really important question. And this is something I feel like at every turn that I get a chance to talk about map making in early America, at least, that needs to be brought up. The United States and also the colonial experience was incredibly unique because the government kept his hands out of the map making business. There's a first hint only during when the 1790 Copyright Act is enacted. That's protecting maps, among other things. That's the only time that the government took like an active role in protecting maps, I guess, in that sense, but not in the production of maps. And what is unique about the American experience, especially from 1800 on forward until the 1870s, is that it's basically a free market enterprise where there's no standard. A lot of land surveyors and a lot of topographers really lament the fact, especially in the military, they lament the fact that all the maps at my disposal tend to be made by cartographers and by commercial publishers, and they take liberties, and they take also the customer's interest in under consideration. So then you have maps that are talking to the customer base, but they're not maps talking to, well, what is our accurate standard? And there was a moment when the General Land Office is founded in 1812 that became a clearinghouse for geodetic, so surveyors' data. But that was basically then only tapped by commercial map makers, so like Henry Schenck Tanner, Samuel Augustus Mitchell, then the Colton brothers. They basically would write to the General Land Office to get the most recent survey data, but then that would be folded into their commercial maps. There was no government arm that was devoted to printing maps, which is, when you think about historically, just unbelievably unique, because in Europe, these maps were treated like state secrets. I mean, a lot of maps were really designed to just actually either mislead the enemy or to protect your nation state from incursions, from encroachment, from any kind of foreign meddling. So that is a fascinating moment to think about the American map enterprise, that this was unregulated, free market economy, driven by supply and demand. If they oversupplied, the map producers came up with all kinds of new packaging strategies on how they could resell actually old and outdated maps, but it had nothing to do with actually having a dialogue with the government of trying to figure out what is the best map to represent the nation state.
So we have instead this commercial sector who's really operating ultimately with a profit motive, and their goal is to sell maps. And of course, one of the things that your book really brings out is that the bigger the map, the better. And we've already seen that more is better. We've got those lithographic presses running off 100 maps an hour to be sold. But you give in your book some wonderful examples of really big maps, of maps that interact with the owner, of maps that are framed as pictures, of maps that function almost as theaters. So I think our listeners would really enjoy seeing some of these examples.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, again, for the audience's sake, the book is actually divided into 3 parts. And so one part is then devoted to the way in which maps were public objects or they were private objects. And what I chose for today is to talk about the way in which these maps were actually operating as public spectacles. And what is, just to give us a sense again on how pervasive and how popular these maps were, is something that we completely lost sight of. And that was during the great exhibition in New York at the Crystal Palace in 1853, that in that exhibition there was actually, if you go to their catalog and into their handouts, on the floor plan, there was one area reserved for map displays. And these were wall maps. They were all varnished, so they would have been incredibly shiny objects from a distance. They actually were staged in an area that the sun would bounce off these maps. So as you walk into this exhibition, the map display, and these were American-made maps only, that would have been quite the experience. I call it the first greatest map show in America at that point. But to give you a sense, so people would have come to this exhibition, and maps were regular contributions to exhibitions, whether they were manufacturing exhibitions or school exhibitions. And people apparently were devoted to seeing wall maps. So on display were mostly the wall maps. And I've chosen one example just to give you a sense of how we would have then interacted with these maps. This map is by Robert P. Smith, the Washington map of the United States. It's actually a copy of a different map by Maury, but that was published a year before. It's fairly large, so about 6 by 6 feet. It would have been hung with heavy wooden rollers. It would have been hung on a wall, probably eye level, maybe slightly higher. And now, as we are all looking at our screen and squinting and everybody's going down, I can't see much because it's such a big map and it's such a small image, and maybe it's even fuzzy to many of you. But that's exactly the experience you would have had. You couldn't have leaned in the way in which we want to lean into a map, right? As we're driving and have our road atlas in our laps, I can actually really put the finger on the map and follow the road. These maps were meant to be visual display objects, and they then asked audiences to either lean in if you bought the map as in atlas form, but from a distance, what would have been really just standing out are some macro elements, whether it is the insert charts or whether it's an insert image, a picture on the top, or whether it's the boundaries, the heavy drawn boundaries between the United States and then Mexico, for example. And that brings me also to the size of these maps, that by the 1850s, these wall map displays or display maps wall maps used as display maps, that they were no longer about the nation state as such. They were really trying to branch out and include the Caribbean basin and Central America. So the boundary between what is the nation state and what is the American empire at this point is beginning to be fudged a little bit. But for the sake of just the experience, this would have been the standard experience. This map or maps like it would have been hanging in school classrooms, I found. School superintendents as early as the 1840s would have ordered large wall maps as staples for their classrooms. They would have been hung behind the teacher. So you as a pupil would have been looking past the teacher's head at the wall. So again, the map is far away. So you would have to be called up to the front and then from memory recite your knowledge by pointing to elements of the large map. So that gives you a sense of how these large maps really began to kind of impact audiences, and they were on display in magistrates' offices, in town halls, and then also in private homes. So that is one of these moments where the social life of maps is really beginning to shape our reaction to them. The next slide gives you another version of a map spectacle. That is, in this case, the county map. These were also fairly sized maps, not as large as the giant large wall maps. They would have been 4 by 5 feet large, possibly 3 by 4 feet. What is unique about them, it just gives you a sense of how people were toggling back and forth between having the big picture view of the nation state or the boundaries beyond, or their region, that they were really invested in their locality. And the best way of how you could demonstrate your investment in your locality would be by having a portrait of your own house or of your own shop, of your own tavern, be part of the visual display of the map. So in this case, it's Hopkins's map of Adams County in Pennsylvania is a great example where your home, your personal property, so to speak, your home is actually then as a form of embellishment is now added to the map, so you could actually zoom in and out of the map. They even gave a little street map attached to your home so that people could really find you. Nobody's worried about privacy at this point, right? So, I mean, but think of it as a precursor to our Google Maps, or as you all call Zillow for your for tax purposes. This would be the moment when you're actually seeing people become really invested in these maps as personal communication platforms. You had to pay extra. If you wanted to have your house as part of the embellishment, you would have to pay extra for these maps. And then the final example for these big map displays, or for these spectacular nature of these maps, I start small, and this is the map of Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado by Samuel Augustus Mitchell. This is an atlas map, and on first sight, it looks really kind of pedestrian, right? I mean, you have the basic ingredients of the map. You have very heavy-handed washes of watercolor. So this was done in a rush. I mean, this is a piecework. People were, at this point, the map painters, and mostly they were women who actually, that was a career for women to be a map painter. They were just painting hundreds of these maps during a week. But what is unique about this atlas map is it's packaged and formatted as if it were a painting. It still has an ornate frame, as if you're looking at a portrait of a person, or as if you were looking at a landscape painting. So just imagine this would be like the lithographer's adaptation of a wooden frame that would have then given you the boundary to the map. And if you go to the next slide, you can see how this was actually taken to some extremes by some map makers. This is Alden's pictorial map of America. And what is fascinating about this is that the nation state is in this case encircled by landscape views that already were popular by the time that the map was published. So he's basically copying other people's prints at this point. And one that stood out to me particularly is the Catskill Mountain House, which in the circle of images would be the third one on the top from the right. You see the magnified version on the top right in your slide. But this was a view that was actually copied from Bartlett's painting The Mountain House. And as an English professor, of course, to me, this speaks volumes because it is the copy, or it is the scene, the setting for James Fenimore Cooper's The Pioneers, when you have Natty Bumppo, or Hawkeye as he's better known, give a very eloquent speech about the history of America, being seated, as we now know, exactly in the location of the Catskill Mountain House. So my audience would have been totally in tune with that. And if anything, so this I find is this fascinating interplay of visual culture and map culture. If anything, my audience really perceived these maps to be not necessarily competitors, but certainly as being part and parcel of this continuum of what is visual art in early America. And maps were really treated as visual objects, as picture objects, pictorial objects, as much as they were treated as wayfinding tools and ways of representing space.
And this use of maps and the real relationship between the user, or not, I wouldn't call it the user even, just the viewer and appreciator and audience for the map, and the connections with literature, means that maps in their social space really are part of a whole national conversation. It is not unusual for people to have this idea of American space in their minds when they're taking part in any other kind of debate or discussion. And your book concludes with a wonderful broadside that captures this kind of national discussion centered around a map. So if you could take us through this one.
This is one of these eureka moments as a researcher. A lot of map commentary comes out of satirical cartoons, satirical drawings like this one. This is a cartoon that's lambasting, or lampooning, I should say, the election of 1860. You see Lincoln to the far left. But what stood out to me was the fact that, yes, on the metaphoric level, the election is tearing apart the country, and the country is being represented by a map as a stand-in metaphor for the nation state. But in the light of the fact that audiences by this point would have had maps hanging on their walls, would have had these very personal relationships to the physical art, to see politicians tear the fabric of a map physically, literally tearing the fabric of the map, would have really drilled home almost like a visceral response in my audience at that point, because people would have slaved, and I mean, would have worked so hard on drawing their own maps, and then get them to suddenly, as like in this case, as a castaway gesture, right? Let's shred the map. That would have just really resonated with audiences. And it comes down to the point that the national map really was a tool that helped the period of nation building. It helped Americans give themselves a sense of identity. And the moment somebody's taking away that map, that image, that physical artifact, it left a lot of people feeling stranded and really questioning their sense of identity as American citizens.
So that connection to maps, I think, is summed up in a quote that you use in your book that I think is a good way of our kind of finishing what we want our audience to take away from today's discussion about maps in this period.
Yeah, this was one of these fascinating moments in 1865. Ralph Waldo Emerson, this is not published, this is in his diaries at this point, basically was taking stock of what the Civil War had done to Americans. It was really like a rambling musing on, oh my gosh, we paid such a high price. The cost was just overwhelming. We gained in the sense that we liberated people, we freed people, but we also lost, of course, lives. And in the end, he comes down to saying, at the end of this kind of clearly Emersonian style kind of musing, he comes down to saying, in every house and shop, an American map has been unrolled and daily studied. And now that peace has come, every citizen finds himself a skilled student of the condition, means, and future of this continent. So at the end of having 5 years of war, where people were using maps to really kind of just trace out enemy and friends, family members being stuck far away or being lost far away, suddenly he's turning to maps again as this device for creating peace, for creating unity, for using and tapping basically at this point a 60-year-old or even 80-year-old tradition of turning to maps in order to make sense of yourself as an American citizen. And it has a prophetic quality to it, actually, because then going forward in the 1870s, maps really became the staple of American education until roughly probably we had what we think today of as the Sputnik effect, right? Until the 1950s, when geography got kicked out of the curriculum. But this is where it really, for me, it hit home when you read lines like this, that maps are such an integral part in people's lives.
And can still have that capacity to bring us together as well as tear us apart. So Martin, thank you so much for taking time today to take us through some of the highlights of your book. I highly recommend The Social Life of Maps to any of you because it is a fascinating look at maps in ways that we don't always think about what the map in front of us means. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We all really
more than welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Mary. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I see a lot of people posting their questions in the Q&A section. So anyone else who has questions, please feel free to continue posting there. I am just going to do a couple of housekeeping announcements, and then we'll get to those questions, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. So stay tuned. I want to invite you to join us again next week. On July 17th, we will talk with Jack Dio about his wonderful photography collection in a Collector's Corner episode of the Bookworm. And then on July 24th, we'll be discussing Min is Cheap, Brian Lusky's book, and sort of discussing business and labor history. And Dyke Benjamin and Paul Erickson will join us for that conversation, as well as Brian Lusky. Once you are signed up for the Bookworm, you receive a reminder every week. You don't have to sign up again. You also do not have to worry about watching it live, because you will receive an email with the link to the recording and the resources. We, of course, very much enjoy having you join us live so that you can ask questions and interact with us. So please do that as you are able. And you'll receive that email with the resources later today as well. We also began this Bookworm, as you know, as a way to stay in touch during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are just overwhelmed by the wonderful participation and your enthusiasm for this program, so thank you so much. And as I mentioned in the introductory remarks, today's program was brought to you by the Michigan Map Society in collaboration with the Stephen Clark Library. If you would like to make a gift to the Michigan Map Society Fund, it helps us to put on this kind of programming, and hopefully one day we will do this programming in person once again. So you can make a gift to support that kind of work in map discussions. And if you're interested in sponsoring an episode of the Bookworm, you can always email me to do so. We will continue weekly through August, and then we're working on what the fall schedule will look like. All right, I think it's time for some questions. Looks like we have a lot of them out there, so let's see. Okay. All right, Marshall says, if most strata of society had maps, can it be assumed maps were affordable?
Great question. And yes, what I was trying to trace out for wall maps was like a price profile. And in doing so, I also was able to trace out basically the mass-produced cheap side of maps. And so we had the range of, you could buy a map or get a map, a wall map for $20. That would have been exorbitantly expensive. So that would have been the $500 range today. But the moment you have mass-produced maps in the 1820s kicking in, you would have dropped the price to $1, to 50 cents, to 33 cents. So it would have been really affordable.
Oh, that's wonderful. Jane is asking, what are some of the more surprising ways that you encountered the public interacting with maps in their regular lives?
The map in the bedroom. But in this case, it's actually an immigrant family, and they have a pocket map that is unfolded and hanging over their mantelpiece. And so here's a family in New York, I think it was New York City. I talk a little bit about it in detail in the book. And all the prized possessions of this family are on display. So you can see a bed stand, so the bed frame, right? Because that would have been a big object that you own that actually has value. You see books, you see the needlework basket, and then on the mantelpiece you see a few knickknacks, and then you see this map, which is for this immigrant family at once like the future, right? And at the same time, that was their only wall decoration that they had. They couldn't afford a picture print, but they wanted to have the map as a wall hanging, as some kind of decorative element. That was elements. Another one was that people used maps on dance floors. So they were actually doing social dances having the continental outline drawn on the dance floor. I mean, beats me what they were dancing to, but I couldn't find that. But that was another really odd, surprising moment of interaction. And then just I guess the sheer range of theatrical engagements with maps. Literally on the theater stage here in Philadelphia, they would have had maps as mock-up versions of maps. But then in the house where people were using the map as a way of riffing each other, as a way of having a conversation with neighbors or with strangers. Those are the really kind of eye-opening moments.
Thank you. Paul is asking, your talk mostly focused on national maps, but what about the social life of city maps? What role did they play in both orienting new arrivals to cities to the urban environment and in building identification of people as Philadelphians or New Yorkers?
Great question. And this is one of the moments when, as an author, you just have to kind of pick your genre that you run with the most. So there were certain genres like maps that I could only briefly touch upon. They would have been, I mean, that's actually a really important question. They would have been already available in city directories as early as the 1790s, definitely by the 1800s. So the city directories of Philadelphia and New York would have had tiny maps folded in that would have just given you the street grid and so very basic ways of navigating the city. What you might refer to are like really the much more elaborate city maps that we think of today when you go travel. Again, they would have been local, and this is where the kind of decentralized production model kicks in. They would have been locally made and locally consumed. Map makers like the Mitchell Company, or publishing houses like the Mitchell Company, the Colton Company, and before that the Tanner Company, they would have had catalogs, and city maps would have been part of the catalog. And so even if you are from living outside of these cities, you could have ordered yourself a city map. But I couldn't find, and this is the moment when the archive, I can only speak to what the archive tells me in this case. And when people were documenting their cartographic possessions, they didn't mention city maps, but they did mention their national map. That seemed to be something people really wanted to kind of bequeath to their, as a legacy to their family members, or they wanted at least to go on record that they had this type of map in their possession. So that gets me in this murky terrain, right? Were there then no city maps? Of course there were city maps, right? But how did people treat them? Did they treat them as symbolic or sentimental objects the same way they treated a national map or a county map?
Thank you. Madeline is asking, do you think that perhaps the difference between the government-funded maps in Europe and the personally created maps in America could be viewed as a parallel to the divide between larger collectivist versus individualist cultural attitudes?
That's a big question. Yes, why not? I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think in the storyline behind the Lewis Evans biography that I started with in terms of production, right? These were guys, or then later on John Mellish, these were guys who were taking enormous risk. And yes, you would have to think this in terms of the individual entrepreneur, maybe. Let's put it in those terms. Not individualism as an ideology so much, but in this case, people realizing that if I wanted to produce something, I had to take the initiative. I couldn't rely on the government. And also I didn't have the government leaning over my shoulder and kind of censoring me by saying, no, you cannot make these maps, right? So that, yeah, so in that sense, I think it does play into this kind of binary between what is a collectivist society versus the individualist society. I think in terms more along the lines of entrepreneurship, and that the individual entrepreneur actually was willing to take the risk to produce something that might or might not sell, right? I mean, certain maps just flopped. And even Carey was shocked to find that Mason Weems, who was one of his salesmen, the guy who wrote the biography of George Washington, right? Mason Weems coming back from the South and returning a whole bunch of maps and atlases. He said, no, nobody wants them. So yeah, so there's a lot of idiosyncrasy, but also individualized or individualistic decisions that go into this.
I'd also just interject here too that size and history matters. It's a very expensive national surveys, which is where a national agency has to start, is an extremely expensive endeavor. And European countries had already begun that process much earlier, in the late 17th and 18th century. It wasn't sort of government funded, very often monarchies funded surveys, individual princes or principates funded surveys. So there was a habit of national surveying that was already there by the beginning of the 19th century. The United States federal government was still adding to its country. That Mellish map of from sea to sea really gives you an index of this is huge, this is big. And all governments, no matter where you are very reluctant to spend money on what they don't have to spend money on. And Martin's absolutely correct that if the private sector is willing to take the risk, God bless them. We're seeing this with NASA right now. I mean, who's going to map the moon? Well, it's probably not going to be NASA. It's probably going to be Elon Musk. I mean, you know, that tendency to go private, I think also you got to follow the cash and who's going to support and who's willing to take that risk too. So.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you both. Let's see. Michael says, this is a fascinating argument. Have you traced specific differences between early U.S. map making and map making in British Canada in the same time period? And was the quality of maps of Eastern North America different?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I have to admit, no, I did not trace that difference. Maybe Mary can jump in with her fountain of wisdom about American-made maps. Yeah, so I don't want to speculate because no, I do not know that.
I don't either. I'm just turning to look and see. I have an excellent book by the archivist of the Archives of Quebec, who does do a nice survey of very early mapping, but it's government funded in the early 19th century because it's still part of the British Empire. So to what extent, when commercial publishers in Canada become a force, I honestly don't know. It's a good question.
I think, I mean, so this could be a research question back to, I think Michael was it, right? So maybe the War of 1812 could be the filter or the lens to which to look at this, where you see Americans have this massive uptick on maps showing exactly the Northeast, the boundary between Canada and the United States. And it would be now really interesting to do a compare-contrast analysis of maps. Were the same amount of maps produced in Canada at this time, or did people just were happy enough with the government-sponsored maps that already existed? I mean, that would be an interesting follow-up. So thank you. Actually, this is a great research question.
And remember the Nebenzahl lectures of whatever it was on War of 1812.
Yeah.
I can't remember if there was someone there who talked specifically about the Canadian side of things. So that's not published yet, but when that comes out, that'll be a good starting point.
Thank you. Let's see. Sorry, the people are adding questions. Oh, this, Paul is asking, is the Mitchell subscription book for the pocket version of the map or the wall version?
It was for everything. So the evidence I found, and actually the University of Pennsylvania Library has one of the salesman's diaries. So he went out into the field with one of those subscription books in hand, and he basically either was trying to sell overstock, so stuff that was last year's or 2-year-old maps, and they were reprinting and revising maps. I mean, they call them a new edition every year almost. With tiny changes often, even though, of course, new data was coming in about the Western expansions. But in this case, they would have just sold what was on hand. And in his letters to the Mitchell Publishing House, to Mitchell himself, basically just said, I need 5 national maps as wall map, and I need 5 national maps in pocket form. So just send me everything that you have. So yeah, but it's a great question. I mean, I don't think, well, when you look at the actual booklet, the subscription booklet, it did not break down pages by, this is for national map, wall maps is only, or this is a subscription list only for the pocket map version. So people didn't distinguish. in those terms.
Thank you. Let's see. Michael says thank you and is wondering whether you came across maps of reservations, indigenous territory, or Indian country in America's social world maps.
That is fascinating. No, not in private homes so much. I mean, again, my sample database is grounded in the East Coast. So it would be interesting to think now in historical societies further west, if people's diaries or wills or probate records indicate that they had actually maps that traced out reservations. We have, I mean, they do show up on the national map, of course, in these oddly truncated formats where the nation, any nation, Native American indigenous nation, would have been called a nation, but again, nobody gave them boundaries, so that would have been fundamentally just like these odd overlays almost that are inserted into the map. And they do show up. I mean, this is a really fascinating question, because I did see a wall map where somebody had scribbled on it, and these were their own travels, and they had also attached with pins little newspaper clips or personal notes to the wall map. So again, imagine this map is the size, this one particular map was about 6 by 7 feet. So somebody really interacted with that map as like either a memory aid or as a sentimental tool tracking his journey, going to the West and coming back. It was almost more like a message board in a weird way. And one of these little snippets was actually talking about a massacre. And somebody actually then, in this case, the guy had overlaid the original printed information with a note saying, no, something along the lines, no, this is where the massacre actually happened. So again, but this is more tales from the crypt, right? I mean, there's no, I did not find overwhelming evidence that people would have maps showing reservations or Native American territories, period.
Yeah. And most of that kind of mapping was being done by the government. There was a time when the government was involved, and the maps that accompany government pamphlets and documents that are printed as a result of treaties or agreements, and those were not commercially available in the same way that the maps we've been talking about today. So that's a cartography of displacement that is a story still to be written.
Interesting, thank you. Rex is asking if you've traced the contours of the geography in Savage's painting of the, and how it might relate to the plan of Washington, D.C.
You mean, he means the landscape in the background? My colleague in art history, Jennifer Van Horn, I mean, I have to give a big shout out because she helped me actually try to figure out who is the black figure standing in the margin. She has an essay forthcoming actually discussing exactly that. So to what extent is that landscape, the Potomac River, and then which riverbank are they switched from east to west or west east? And then how would that actually map onto the map in the foreground? Is it supposed to be a basically like if you could unfold like a palimpsest, right? If you could unfold the landscape from the map, which actually would have been part of the late 18th century visual experience. A lot of maps. I keep thinking of the Ratza map of New York City, where you have the city plan basically grounded on top of a landscape view, a seascape view, I should say, showing you the skyline of Manhattan, so that you could actually, as a viewer, as a map reader, you're toggling back and forth between I'm inhabiting the landscape, and then I'm looking at its geometrical two-dimensional version right above it in map form. So at this point, I just have to say, stay tuned for this essay. I think it's coming out in the American Art Journal, published by the Smithsonian pretty soon.
Oh, nice. Dyke Benjamin is asking, do you have a recommended book of maps showing the movement of slaves in America over time?
Oh, I wish. That's, no, sorry. Short answer is no. I wish I could do that. That's one of these, I think, going forward, as people are reimagining what is an archive, and as we are reimagining also how we talk about the map archive, that would be one of those major projects. Basically, how do you track maps made by enslaved people, for enslaved people, with enslaved people's help, for example, is one way of thinking about it. And the other one is did people, like the Hergesheimer map, right? Did people actually take statistical information and then just plunk it down to showcase, not in this case, the population density of enslaved people that's the Hergesheimer map, 4, I think, right? As opposed to suddenly tracking movement. That would be awesome.
Yeah, our viewers are coming up with a lot of good research ideas.
I wish I had a lifetime to do this.
Mary, what were you going to add?
I was just going to comment on, with regard to maps and slavery, to that Susan Schulten's work, and I've just lost the title of her book, but that's a person to Google. And during the anniversaries of the Civil War, she had a good series in the New York Times of articles on the interaction between abolition movement, between Americans' understanding of slavery, in the same way that Martin's talked about understanding the geography of the nation. So her work also deserves a mention there.
Thank you. Well, we still have a few more questions left, so we'll try to get through a couple more before we sign off for the day. Allison is asking, were there certain errors that tended to recur in maps of the USA?
Oh, I love that question. Well, one of the biggest errors early on was that map makers imagined some kind of superhighway that cut through Michigan that would just, like a beautiful valley, presumably all arable and good farmland. That was in the early 18th century, and that lasted for a long time. Another error was, I guess, until the 1750s even, to think of California as an island. That was an error that kept popping up. Going forward, I think the Great Desert, in what we think of as Texas now, that people imagine that it's just like this huge sand, like the Sahara. Imagine the Sahara, that would be something like a Great Desert. The German Alexander von Humboldt, for example, was a strong component actually for this theory that there would be a Great Desert. So things like that. On the micro level, if you live in Michigan, and I experience this every time when I'm in the area of Coloma and St. Joseph, as you drive, suddenly the street makes an enormous jog, about like 50 meters, 30 meters off, and you can just see how the surveyors came from two different ends and they missed each other. So, and those errors were made in the 1830s when they surveyed Michigan, and it's odd that it's hilarious in my mind actually at this point to have them still embedded, these errors still embedded in our physical landscape.
Right.
Good point. Someone's asking about the market for trading of antique maps, and I thought that was an interesting question since I know we have a lot of map collectors.
Yeah. And well, as maybe you can ask a question back. Does the person mean?
Well, okay, there's a little bit
today
more.
Or then?
Yes, what is it like? Are there people who decorate their walls with maps because of their artistic aesthetic values? I think it's for now.
Well, but it actually works for both ways. So for now, definitely. We have a very thriving antiques market for maps. Here's one of these moments that in your research that you trip over, and I don't know yet what to make of this anecdote, but the author who wrote War of the Worlds, whose name is now escaping me suddenly. Like
H.G. Wells?
Yeah, H.G. Wells. So science fiction author, right? Who made his living actually writing magazine pieces, puff pieces almost, for Better Home and Gardens magazines in the 1910s. And two of his essays, and this is what happens when you work with Winterthur, because you come across information like this with the Winterthur Museum. Two of his essays were about wall maps in country houses on the East Coast in America in circa 1910. So as a decorative object, people were collecting these maps as picture display in a big painting. But historically, which I also find fascinating, you can go back to the last governor of Virginia, Governor Botetourt, who in his mansion in Williamsburg had basically old maps. In 1774, he had old maps from the 1750s on display. and caused quite the ruckus when he basically demoted the Jefferson Fry map, so Thomas Jefferson's dad's map of Virginia, putting it into the hallway, and instead hung the John Henry map, which also showed Virginia, in the dining room above the mantelpiece. And so people who are using these new maps, antique maps, as a way of playing power games and mind games in a way in their homes. I mean, he was a politician, so it clearly was a political gesture. But then we also know, of course, Jefferson in Monticello had his house just plastered with maps. And in my book, I have a few anecdotes where in popular magazines, people actually, the wives actually especially, are complaining about the husbands constantly hanging up maps on the walls. And coming back to the question, was there an antiques market? The Mellish history actually ends, in my book, ends on the note that his maps became antiques very quickly shortly after, that they showed up as, oh, look, once upon a time we had like these weird looking maps, which was only 5 years ago by their count then, but it was already treated as something that's collectible. So it started very early in the 18th century that you collected maps.
Thank you. Rex is asking, when did the large roll-up wall maps of counties begin, financed by a subscription? What portion of map-making industry would they have represented? And he's pointing out that the county maps in Michigan are pretty large, 6 by 8.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. Robert P. Smith is the dynamo behind this. And I think in terms of recovering the history of county maps, I still have to refer you guys to Walter Ristow's book, American Map Makers. He has pretty much by this point still the most exhaustive chapter describing county map production and the circulation of these maps. But it was, in this case, Robert P. Smith as almost like single-handedly invented the genre of the county map. And he basically figured out, I have to make them big up front. There are no tiny, like apple-sized county maps really in circulation. That comes out later in the 1870s and 1880s. But before the Civil War, they were meant to be big, and they, in terms of market share, that's hard to gauge, because when I look at the inventories of the various publishing houses, since they were printing on demand in many cases based on their subscriptions, it's hard to tell how many of these maps were, numerically speaking, were in circulation. We know that there were, I think, over 400 different county maps designed by Robert P. Smith. So that gives you at least a sense of genres and kind of the range. I mean, he basically was trying to capture every county in the Northeast and Midwest.
Yes. So we have 2 more that I think you might want to answer, but it is already 11:30, so we could do that offline if you if you are ready for a break.
No, please keep on going. I love it.
Okay, all right. I know I'm thoroughly entranced, so if I weren't looking at the time, I'd have no idea. I thought this one was interesting. Cheryl's asking, where do Holy Land maps fit in? They were quite common by mid-19th century for Sunday school books, posters, wall maps, the general, population.
Right. Yes, and so thanks for bringing that up. In my book, I say a little bit about the Holy Land maps. They were in church displays. Actually, some of the very first map display mechanisms. So should you have a pulley system, or should you have some kind of tripod or something to actually maps, was designed for churches, not so much for schools, so that people would actually. And I have a stereotype, which unfortunately I couldn't include in the book because it was from the 1870s, but I have a stereograph of a church interior where next to the pulpit is the map on a wall map on display in church. So yes, they were a big component, definitely for also the map makers' kind of portfolio again. The missionary societies were strong customers of international maps, obviously, but they were also strong customers devising their own missionary maps. I think actually of this, the largest, I mean, I actually have this whole thing about map giants. One of the largest surviving map was published by the Mitchell Company, and that was a missionary map, and it really measured, I think, 12 feet wide. It was consisted of 2 components, and so you had the hemispheres, 2 different hemispheres, but they would be sutured together so that you would have a ginormous map. that gives you, or 10 feet wide, I'm sorry, 10 feet wide. So that gives you a sense that, yes, maps showing the Holy Land, but also then adapted or co-opted by missionary societies. That was all part of the production line.
Thank you. We have another question about the county maps. So Bill Marvel is saying the detailed county maps produced in New England, at least, between about 1858 and 1861 included every building in every town and identified the owners or occupants of all of them, including economically marginal tenants who could not have afforded to contribute. Would there have been another incentive for subscriptions, or would sales to town and county agencies have made it cost effective?
So that's fascinating to hear that even the poor person's home would have been captured by the address. And here I come back to a city map produced by also Robert Smith for Philadelphia. It's a circular map. I think it's called the 10 miles map, 10-mile radius or circle map of Philadelphia. And the logic, from what I understand there, was that it was actually, I mean, it wasn't directly sponsored by the city government, but the map maker was in kind of cahoots with the city government, because by capturing everybody's address, he also captured the taxpayers' base. So even though they didn't really make money off the poor people who didn't contribute to the subscription because they couldn't afford buying the map, presumably, or had no interest maybe, but there were payoffs in other ways. Well, that would be an interesting research question again. To what extent did then these highly detailed county maps, what kind of role did they play in local politics, right? Whether it's enforcement of taxation, whether it is licensing, right, of your businesses, whether you have a public house like a tavern or something like that. Could it be held against you, right, if your name is on those maps? I mean, to what extent is this about voting records too, or voter ballot records, right? I mean, I wonder. I mean, that's something I speculate. I have no further knowledge, but that's a fascinating observation. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you, everybody, for so many good questions. And thank you so much for being with us, Martin. We're so glad to catch up with you in this format since we couldn't see you in person. And Mary, thanks so much for your good discussion and questions.
Not at all.
So
Delighted to be here.
Great. Everybody have a great weekend, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Thanks,
Martin.
Martin.